talk. Talk about it. Woman to woman. Yo, let's go. Talk about it. Talk about everything. Woman to woman. Yo, woman to woman. Let's talk.
Welcome to a special Father's Day episode of Woman to Women. Of course, I'm not Pastor Deborah. My sisters aren't Pastor Deborah, but we are honored today to bring you a special edition of this show to talk about Father's Day, to talk about our Father and to help you to honor the men in your life. And of course, even the men that check this out are going to get something that really helps them to be the men that God wants them to be. And so, as I said, I have with me my sisters, Pastor MiChelle and Minister Kristina. And we're going to talk a little bit about our dad and then some other things along those lines. And so, first of all, question for you guys. What was it like growing up with someone who was not only your dad, but was a spiritual leader to many?
It's a good question, Pastor André. I'll throw that right back at you. No. It was interesting at times, right? So there were some things that were really good in it, and there were some things that were a little more challenging. Particularly for me, at one point, once I got to the age where I was in youth church and I wasn't in children's church anymore, so I'm in the sanctuary on Sundays, I had to just kind of focus and drown out the fact that he was my dad when he was speaking, because like many people in the congregation, sometimes you think something being said is directed at you. And you're like, you just not feeling. I didn't feel yesterday. You made me re-clean my room when I want to hear nothing you have to say. So I actually learned to like separate the two during service. And I would kind of tell myself, okay, this is your pastor speaking. This is not your dad at the moment, unless he started telling an embarrassing story, in which case I would just be like, the preacher's kid plight. So that was interesting. And sharing him with other people, that was more of a challenge for sure. It wasn't as much of a, growing up and, oh yeah, hey dad, that's not your dad. Yeah, you're 14, like it's not your dad. But, it was cool at the same time because I did get to see the lessons. Like I got to see behind the scenes who you are. So I got to see like he's up early and he is in his office spending time with the Lord. You know what I mean? Like he's like, that's what he's going to do. Like it's clockwork. He had a regular routine, even a routine for Saturdays and how he went through the day on Saturday. And so it's almost like a master class kind of, you catch things. That was a great blessing for me to see like the consistency. And I know it's the same thing for your girls, to see the consistency. Like this is the time where dad is praying, or this is the time where, this is happening. And that was a great blessing to me because I got to see both sides of that, the front of the house and, kind of the back.
Yeah, I think you kind of said it very well. I think some of the adjustments that were made as a result of him being in both positions, some of that I didn't realize until I was an adult looking back, because I thought they did a fairly good job of trying to normalize our life outside of the church. And I really, really appreciated that, that he didn't come home and do sermons to us. And that, I remember somebody asking me when I was in youth church, was like, does your dad wear suits around the house? And I thought it was the most absurd question. But from their perspective, I guess they're seeing him just in that role. That was something that I appreciated, that I could say that the answer was no to that. I think too, like Kristina said, I really had to learn early how to separate the person from the grace or the anointing. And I think that's just really standard, because even Jesus talks about that, where he couldn't do mighty works because of their unbelief, and their unbelief came from familiarity. So that was something I had to really work hard on, especially in my teenage years. And I think, though at those times that wasn't easy, it's definitely a skill that that I use a lot now. And that's really important, because regardless of who you're listening for what the Holy Spirit is saying.
Right.
And the enemy will always try and find distractions to stop you from hearing what it is you need to hear. Like you're praying for this answer and there it is right there, but it's not in the package you wanted it,
Right.
or it's not, whatever. So I think that was kind of a benefit in that sense to, that was a benefit to have to really learn to work those muscles when we were younger. Sharing them with so many other people. I was kind of in and out on that, I think. Actually, I didn't like that. I just gotta be real with that. Partially because the pastor's heart I didn't have. So the people that he would like allow to mistreat him, or his response to them when they were mistreating us, or they were one way with him and then us behind the scenes, and then some of the PK issues. And not everybody was crazy, but especially when you're not mature, you can just focus on like 10 people that are crazy and have 10,000 that are great. You know what I mean? And so my world felt that way. And so that was a little bit more challenging for me from that standpoint. And like you said, people are calling him dad and people taking up his time, or people, whatever, that was harder for me. But like I said, God never wastes a battle, and any and everything you go through can be used as you move forward. And that I can definitely say. What about you?
Yeah. I don't have as many vivid memories as you guys do from growing up, and I think maybe that's a male-female thing. They tell you that boys try to forget their childhood, and because it's when they were a little bit more vulnerable, and girls cherish it. But I do remember a lot, and I remember, and we'll probably talk about this a little bit more as we get into this, the example that was set. There was definitely a way that I saw him operate. There was a way I saw he and mom operate in terms of, they would have people that would stay at our house sometimes because they were in need. They needed some help. And sometimes that was family, sometimes that was other people. And then, of course, as you get older, learning to receive from the gift on the stage. And for me, there was a place in my thinking, my approach, where I wasn't hearing dad, I was hearing Pastor Butler or Bishop Butler, and kind of separating the two, even starting to work for him. Same thing, where at home is dad, and you might talk a certain way and be a certain way, but when you come to church, and this is kingdom business, we're about winning souls, there's a certain way you need to operate. So these are things that I had to learn. But I think it's a benefit to have been in a home where we were able to be ourselves for the most part. We were able to have a normal childhood, and at the same time, watch parents who were serving a community. So here's another question that's similar. Did you ever feel pressure to act or live in a certain way because of who your father was in the church?
Absolutely.
Unequivocally.
I mean, I would say that as I started to really develop my own relationship with the Lord, that was one of the first things that I had to address, because I recognized that I remember just going on a cruise once in my 20s with some friends, and I have my own standards of how I live, but I literally the first day was walking around the boat to see if there were any Word of Faith people on the boat. And because I was gonna determine my level of cut up or not, because I was like, I don't want to. I mean, and I wish I could say like I don't have any real big horror stories. I didn't go too far off the reservation, in terms of as a teenager or anything. But I really wish I could say that was 100% because I just had a heart for God. Some of it was I didn't want to embarrass my parents. I had respect for them. And I knew that if I was out here wilding out, that dad could be fighting that battle, even in the papers at some points in our lives where it was just stupidity and pettiness. And so some of that was that. But I remember on that boat, like just kind of getting a kind of an inkling from the Lord, kind of saying like, okay, so should whether or not Word of Faith people are on this boat be the determining factor of how you act? And that's when I really had to start to learn to check my heart motives and make sure that I'm doing what I do for the Lord. But absolutely, I felt an intense amount of pressure. And I think, again, with the church and people, and I know you talk a lot about this, church hurt,
Mm-hmm.
and just all of that. Almost felt like you couldn't be human. Being at the movie theater with your friends, trying to be cool, and somebody like, does your father know you're here and what you're going to see? And just
And being like, what? Who are you? What is your name? I
right,
don't. This
like
is...
people writing letters and lying on you, and just kind of like, I'm glad my parents, though. I remember somebody wrote a letter to dad and was saying that they saw me and a young guy, in a corner in the church inappropriately having contact with each other. And instead of them wilding out, they came and did some investigation. They asked me who I was with, and it was my cousin.
Mm-hmm.
So it was just a busybody. Somebody's like, "Ooh, she with a young man," but you don't know. That's like, that's my
Yeah.
cousin.
Right.
And I was glad that's how they approached a lot of that, because had they not, I think that really could have bubbled over and caused more problems for me.
Yeah, I think that's the thing. I feel like they did not respond out of embarrassment when somebody brought something to them that looked bad when it came to us. Like they actually seemed to respond more out of making sure they raised us right. And I'm sure that was a struggle at times because you're forced into, even if you're trying to stay away from it, there still is this image that's projected, and people are immature, and, in a lot of cases. And so they expect things to look a certain way. But I feel like, whereas I have friends that are preachers' kids, or even my husband, different people that have different stories about how they were punished for something that was ridiculous
Right.
repeatedly, or something that really was untrue. They did give us an opportunity to speak to things that came up. And sometimes, like by the time I was in my 20s, maybe my teens, I might have been 19 or 20, and somebody had brought up, they saw me and my boyfriend holding hands in the church or something like that. And really what it was is I was walking up some steps, and my boyfriend put his hand out to help me up the steps, like in front of, in the same area we might walk. And they mentioned it. And by then, dad was the one that they said it to. And he was like, I've given them permission to hold hands. Like I didn't know I needed that.
Right.
But he knew, like at that point,
Right.
yeah,
He knew the
you got a
game.
little more sense than
Yeah.
that. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
That you're not just, about to be sitting up in the church and, leaning on each other, doing a bunch of stuff
Right.
that looks ridiculous.
Right.
But yeah, no, I mean, I definitely, like MiChelle said, I definitely did feel some pressure, just based on the stereotype, right? Because I feel like people respond to the stereotype different ways. Like some people that are preachers' kids respond to the stereotype like, "Oh, preachers' kids are wild." So they're like, "Cool, I have an excuse. It's what you expect. This is what I'm gonna do." And I didn't want to be that either. I didn't want to be like, and I also didn't want to be the black sheep. And I felt like I heard a lot about sometimes the youngest being like that, from different families, different things that I would see. So I was kind of fighting that battle too. Like, I don't want to just be out here doing whatever. And like she said, at a certain point, I had to just make a determination. And I still have moments where I have to like check my motive. What is I'm doing something good, or I'm doing something I even might feel called to do, but what's driving me in doing it? And like, cause if I'm doing it out of someone else's expectation, or if I'm doing it out of something else, there's no credit for that. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Like I have to make sure that my heart is right, and that because it can spin off of its axis.
Right.
You know what I mean? Just because my intent isn't right. So yeah, I definitely felt pressure. I definitely, I was on that cruise she was talking about, and I remember her walking around looking for fake people, and I remember cracking up laughing. And I didn't quite do it that way, but I was attentive to like who was around. And it wasn't even, like if I'm gonna order a Shirley Temple, which is a Sprite with grenadine in it, cherries, I would calculate that stuff. Like
'Cause it looks
somebody
bad.
might think that this is a drink, so I have to think through: does that look bad? Are there people around? And making certain decisions based off of that, and not wanting to cause other people to stumble, like finding that little space. So yeah, I mean, I definitely felt pressure, but the pressure really wasn't from mom and dad.
Yep.
Right.
And I think that's a big difference.
Yeah.
If it was from them, I think I would have responded differently.
Oh, I most definitely would have. I think that's one of the better things that they did was, and mom was really, really good at kind of saying this to us. So she was like, I want you to go to heaven. I'm not worried about impressing people. They don't matter. Like that. And I think that was the key, that through the pressure, that we still were able to make good choices
Right.
and become, whole people. What would you say to that?
Yeah, it's interesting when you grow up in this bubble where you're a preacher's kid, you don't realize how much it impacts everything.
Yep.
And I would have said um, when I was a teenager, I don't have a whole lot of pressure because of other people. I'm doing what I'm supposed to do. But I had a few moments, maybe my early 20s or so, where I didn't make horrible choices, but I made a couple of choices that I shouldn't have made. And the pressure I felt in that moment, like, oh no, what's gonna happen? Is this gonna impact the church, my dad, our reputation, on and on and on? And I realized then, like, wow, this is really like a part of my life. Like, this is my world, and I've been feeling this pressure all this time, and I understood why people would run
Mm-hmm.
because most people don't live under that pressure. You don't have to think about thousands of people's opinion of you and your actions or inactions impacting your whole family, your family's livelihood, your family's ministry, but you're like 17.
Mm-hmm.
That was not what most people have to deal with. And so I think I agree with you all in terms of the way our parents handled it was great. A lot of PKs had the opposite.
Mm-hmm.
One reason why PKs run is because they have pressure at home to act like they are ministers
Mm-hmm.
while they are kids. And we didn't have that. They made it very clear that we were to be us, that we were to live right for the right reasons, that, they were on our side versus on the side of people that maybe are, telling on us or trying to get clout, as we used to say, with them because of spying on us. They did really well in that respect, and I think that helped.
Mm-hmm.
So it's very real, though, and of course, I've got my three daughters a little older. You guys got your kids, and it's only helped me in some conversations um, because I'm able to just say what was said to us. I had a conversation recently, and it was like, I don't care about church folk and what it looks like in this world. I want you to be doing what you're supposed to do,
Yeah.
and it comes across authentic because that's how they've been raised.
Mm-hmm.
Because that's how we were raised.
Yeah.
So another question that I can ask you if you're cool with it is how did you feel he balanced his role as, of course, when we were growing up, pastor and then bishop, uh, with his role as father at home?
I really felt growing up he did that well. I
Mhm.
thought I have a couple of moments that are so marked. They're like marked into my life.
Mhm.
Um, Couple of things like obviously when we were growing up, the church was at the height, and it was just like all over the place. And he was busy, and then he was doing the politics thing, and so he was all over the place. And I remember that he could be in meetings with important people, the mayor, whatever, and we could interrupt. I thought that for me that was a very marked thing. And he would. I remember walking in, maybe because I was the only one busting in meetings, but I remember walking in meetings and him saying, "Excuse me, my child, they come first," and the people kind of being like, "Oh." I remember that. And then secondarily, I remember being in Rhema and I had gotten really sick, and it was just to the place where I was 18,
Mhm.
18 or 19, something like that. And I was really, like, I really felt sick. So I knew my dad was flying and preaching at another church in another state. And so I reached out to my mom and I just told her, like, that I wasn't really feeling well. And I actually felt like I was going to die. And, um, and, I just told her, don't tell my dad. I just wanted somebody to know. So if you didn't hear from me for a couple of days, y'all go, what was going on? So, and then it had to be like 2.5 hours later. because mom is not as responsive. She's like, okay, I'm praying for you, and she hang up the phone. So like 2.5 hours later, the door was like, there was somebody at the door, and I opened the door. It's my dad in a full suit. He left the speaking engagement right before he's about to preach to come, and he never got invited back to that place again. But I felt really bad about it. I was like, you could at least preached, and it came. Like, I felt bad about it, but he was very quick to shut down. Like, this is my first ministry, and then people can do X, Y, Z, and I think for me that was important. That made a mark moment for us. And then he was always at our games, and I see that now with the grandkids. He's ending meetings here today to make like little soccer games,
Little elementary
excuse me,
soccer.
the staff director's
First
meeting,
grade.
right?
Or my kid might not even play. No.
Right.
So I think that was important. And I think for balance, it's going to be different in each situation and each season. And there's some seasons where maybe not as much. But I think the most important thing, and I try and carry this with my kid, is what your first responsibility is. And that's as a parent. And you've been given this wonderful life.
Right.
And you got to do what you got to do to make the sacrifices, whatever you need to do to kind of, while you have that life, you have that massive impact on that life. And that's something my husband and I are making some massive decisions. I've had to make many massive decisions for our son. And it was easy to do. And sometimes when people hear about it, they're like, oh, wow, you guys are great parents. I'm like, this is what we saw.
Mm-hmm.
This is also what Lee's parents were like, too, what they saw.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm thankful for that.
Yeah, I mean, you said most of, like, I don't know that I have anything else to add to that, but just making sure that they were at, he made sure he was at events, and, no matter what was going on, or if I was having an issue or something, he showed up. So, I mean, I definitely felt as though the role was important to him. And even like, I don't know how he did it. I'm built a little differently as far as like my energy levels than you and him, kind of like, and I guess you too. I don't really know. I think you're in between. But the things that he was just very intentional about, taking us out to eat once a month and having those conversations where, he was directing and instructing us for future things that sometimes I may have it. My memory is a little cloudy about childhood too, but sometimes I'll have a moment where I remember something said in that TGI Fridays.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. And you know what else he said? Like he was like, oh, and one day you're going to grow up, you're going to want to get married. And these are the things that are important. It's not important this, that, and the other. These are the things that are important about who you marry. And that soundtrack would play in my head as I'm measuring, somebody that has interest in front of me, is like, do they check these boxes? Okay, they look like it. Let me keep watching. Like, that kind of thing. So it wasn't like, although he had great, all this great acclaim, and there's all these different people that are looking to him and all of that, and you could have minimized that role at home, or it could have been thrown all to mom. He had the things that he knew. These are the things I want to make sure guiding your life. And I thought that was great. You have anything you want to add to that about how he balanced?
No, I think
his
you
role?
guys did a really good job with it. I remember him being at games. And even when I was playing in college, I remember we had our national championship tournament. I don't even know where in the country we were, but he showed up, and that was pretty consistent. He would make sure that no matter what was happening, he was there as a father. And at the time, when you're a kid, you don't always realize everything else that he's doing. But later on, you go, man, you were doing this and you were dealing with this, and then you showed up in my little game, and was giving me advice and talking to the coach, and all of this
Yelling
in the middle
at
of
the
that,
refs.
right? Yelling at the refs, and and he, as you said, he does it with the kids now. I mean, one of my kids, she's a volleyball star, and she actually had to say, hey, kind of tone it down a little bit, because he'd be yelling her name from the stands, and so I think he did a really good job of balancing that. And that I don't know that we felt it as much as a lot of other PKs do. I also feel like, and I know this is a little different than others have talked about, but we didn't necessarily actually live at the church, if you know what I mean by that. And there are some that will teach that, and they'll say that's a great thing, and I'm not against what they're saying. But it wasn't like we weren't at church all day, every day. There was a bit of a separation. We weren't forced to go to youth ministry every week, all those type of things. And I think that some of that was so that there could be, we didn't have to feel that extra pressure. It kind of goes back to what we talked about before. There could be some normalcy in our lives. So I thought that he did a good job of balancing things. Mom did a great job balancing things, and it helped us to balance things.
Mm-hmm.
And we're able to pass that on. So, so another question that I think is really similar to this, and it immediately brings something to mind for me, was there any moments in his ministry that directly impacted you spiritually, or I should say personally, when you were growing up, positively or negatively? And I'll actually start with this one. So I remember being about maybe 17. We were at the Nevada church. That was the bouncing balcony. And so we used to have Sunday school, and then we come out onto the balcony. And then later on, that was just where all the young folk were. So I remember being there, and he preached this message on 1 Kings 17. And it was talking about the prophet Elijah and how God had told him to go by the brook Cherith, and he would have ravens feed him there. And he hit that word there so hard. It's like, you want to be there where God wants you to be. And that has driven my life to this day. I mean, probably the biggest thing that drives me is being there in God's perfect will for my life.
Mm-hmm.
And my children have probably heard me tell them that a million times. They're probably fed up with it. But there's so much truth in that you have to be there.
Mm-hmm.
And I got that from that moment. I remember that. And I went to church every Sunday pretty much, right? And every Wednesday, and I heard a lot of different messages. But that moment came through my father. And it has had a huge impact on my life. How about you guys?
You still pondering which one you want? Okay. So, this one's tough for me because I had I had a specific message that was in mind, but I'll just have what I have. I've told this story before. When I was 16 years old, I also had the benefit of watching you guys, right?
Mm-hmm.
And watching the decisions you made, and you guys graciously sharing with me at times, like what you might have done differently or what you were thinking about something. So watching what you all did as far as what God wanted you to do, I made a determination. I'm going to end up doing what God wants me to do.
Mm-hmm.
So whether I feel ready or whether I feel, qualified or any of the rest of that, I might as well do what God's telling me to do.
Mm-hmm.
And so at 16, I remember junior year of high school, I came to sit down with Dad and talk to him about, I felt like, I'm called to the ministry, and I feel like I'm supposed to go to Rhema. I didn't say I feel like, but, I am supposed to go to Rhema because the Lord had told me. And it was a negative. This one is initially negative, but turns out positive. So his first response, which I completely get looking at my own kids now, his first response was, well, he's like, well, you're a little green. I think maybe you should. At this point, I had a 4-year academic scholarship to the University of Michigan. And I was like, I think maybe you should go to the University of Michigan first. And, just to kind of, because I had a lot of growing up that I needed to do. I was the youngest. And I'll leave it at that. So there were just a lot more of that development that I needed, even just as far as paying attention to your surroundings, knowing where you're going, you know what I mean? When you're driving, like there were a lot of things that I was still not quite where I probably needed to be for various reasons.
You're making me think about my daughter.
Yeah, I know.
Are you there yet?
One in particular, but let me be careful
Are you
here.
there now?
Shut up.
Oh, no.
I am there now. Thank you. But no, and so I get where he was coming from. He was like, but he heard me. I mean, he didn't shoot it down. He just said, it just was enough for me to be like, all right, well, maybe I missed it. And then I remember sitting in a service in this building, because we moved into this building around my junior or senior year of high school, something like that. So I remember sitting in the sanctuary, and there was somebody else speaking. And at the time, I think Dad was sitting on a stage, and I don't know what the speaker was speaking, and I'm trying to take notes and pay attention. At this point now, I'm 17. This is the next year. I've already committed to go to Michigan. I picked my roommate, paid my enrollment fee, all that good stuff. And so I literally am sitting there, and the Lord said, I didn't tell you to go to Michigan. I told you to go to Rhema. And I was like, so we had this whole conversation just kind of sitting there. Well, Lord, you also, this is the authority you put me under. I said, I'm willing to go. If this is what you want me to do, you're going to have to tell him. And so then, you know, service ends and he's coming down off the stage right around the time I'm heading out the door. And he's like, you're supposed to go to Rhema. And I was like, yeah, I told you that last year, you know, being the jerk that I am and probably was though. But I was like, yeah, no, I told you that last year, being a teenager and snarky a little bit. But at the same time in my heart, you know, I was like, wow, that was fast. You know what I mean? That was really cool that he's there and he's pastoring right now and he's shepherding, you know, but he still is open to hear and receive from the Lord. And to hear something like that. And then the next day, that was it. I filled out my application, did everything or whatever. That was a very big moment for me, with him as my dad, with him as my pastor, and then even just demonstrating like God's faithfulness and his ability to speak. So that's probably the one I would say.
Stay tuned for part 2 of this episode of Woman to Woman.
Is there room for improvement at your house? Have the fires of marital bliss turned to smoldering embers in your marriage? Do you wonder how you and your spouse will ever see eye to eye and live together in harmony? Are financial pressures and conflicts about child raising have you at each other's throats? You don't have to have severe problems to realize there's room for improvement in your home and family life. Order your copy of Home Improvement today. In this book, Keith Butler and his wife, Deborah L. Butler, offer candid solutions from God's Word for marriages in crisis, as well as marriages caught in the doldrums of old routines and the cares of everyday life. Whether you have a family crisis or just want to enhance your family's relationships, you can improve the quality of your home life from the teaching contained in this book. Order Home Improvement by Bishop and Pastor Deborah Butler today. Available now